Before the United States existed, 13 small colonies dared to challenge the most powerful empire the world had ever known. No one believed they could survive, let alone win. The British Empire commanded the greatest navy on earth and a battle-hardened professional army. Yet something stirred in the hearts of ordinary men and women, a quiet, dangerous idea that could not be unspoken. From a tax dispute over a stamp to a declaration that shook the foundations of monarchy, the road to revolution was paved with sacrifice, betrayal, and unlikely courage. This is the entire story of how America defeated the British Empire. Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where the echoes of history come quietly back to life. If you find comfort in slow stories told beneath the weight of centuries, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if it truly speaks to you. Leave a comment tonight with where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something quietly moving about knowing that people in distant cities are settling into the same story at this hour. Tonight's question: did you ever wonder whether the American Revolution could have failed and what the world might look like if it had? Make yourself comfortable now. Let the outside world grow distant. Take a slow breath and allow yourself to drift into the story of the entire story of the American Revolution. Chapter 1: Seeds of Revolution. The Colonies. Before the Storm. Long before the first shots were fired, long before the pamphlets and the protests and the petitions, there was simply land. Vast, quiet, ancient land stretching from the rocky shores of New England southward, through fertile river valleys and dense forests, all the way to the warm, humid lowlands of Georgia. 13 colonies, each with its own story, its own temperament, its own way of life, and yet all of them bound, in ways that were only beginning to be understood, to a single distant crown. The oldest of these colonies was Virginia, where the first permanent English settlement had taken root at Jamestown in 1607. Massachusetts followed, beginning with the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620, and then the Great Puritan Migration into Massachusetts Bay a decade later. Over the generations that followed, colony after colony came into being: Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, the Carolinas, New York taken from the Dutch, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Delaware, and finally Georgia, the youngest of them all, chartered in 1732 with its first settlers arriving at Savannah in 1733. Each colony was planted in a different season of history, each for different reasons, each shaped by the different hands. And yet, for all their differences, these 13 colonies shared something remarkable. They were places where ordinary people had learned, slowly and quietly, to govern themselves. As early as 1619, Virginia had established its House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative body in colonial America. Massachusetts followed in 1634, Connecticut in 1637, Maryland in 1638. By the early 18th century, every colony had its own assembly, modelled loosely on the British Parliament, with an upper council and a lower chamber of elected representatives. These assemblies had grown powerful over the decades. They controlled local taxation. They approved or withheld colonial expenditures. They determined the salary of the royal governor, which gave them a quiet but formidable lever of influence. They set their own procedural rules and elected their own speakers. In short, they had learned the habits of self-government, and those habits had become over time something close to a way of life. Helping to nurture those habits was an unofficial but deeply consequential policy that historians would later call salutary neglect. It began in the early 18th century under British Prime Minister Robert Walpole, a quiet, deliberate loosening of the strict trade regulations that were meant to govern colonial commerce. The Navigation Acts, the Woolen Act, the Hat Act, the Iron Act, all of them remained on the books, but enforcement grew lax, almost casual. Smuggling flourished. Illicit trade networks spread quietly from port to port. And as long as the colonies remained broadly loyal, supplied raw materials and purchased British goods, London seemed content to look the other way. The effect of this neglect was profound. Commerce grew, wealth accumulated, colonial assemblies expanded their authority with little interference from across the Atlantic. A distinct sense of identity began to take shape. Not quite English, not quite anything else, but something new, something that was slowly learning to call itself American. The economic life of the colonies during the 18th century reflected all of this diversity and vitality. New England turned its rocky harbours and abundant timber into a world of shipbuilding and merchant trade, exporting fish and lumber, importing tea and sugar, sending its vessels across the Atlantic and along the colonial coast. The middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, became a broad and bustling heartland of grain, livestock, iron, and early manufacturing. Philadelphia and New York grew into thriving commercial centres, cosmopolitan and busy, drawing settlers from England, the Netherlands, Germany, Ireland, and beyond. Further south, the picture was different. The southern colonies had built their wealth on the land itself. Vast plantations of tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, rice and indigo in the Carolinas, worked by the labour of enslaved African men and women whose suffering underwrote the comfort of the planter class. It was a society shaped by hierarchy and silence, by the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the demands of export markets. And it was a society whose contradictions, of liberty proclaimed by those who held others in bondage, would echo through the coming revolution in ways that no one had yet fully reckoned with. By the 1770s, the colonial economy had grown to account for roughly 40% of the British Empire's gross domestic product. Export values to Britain had tripled since the early 1700s. The colonies were no longer fragile outposts. They were something closer to a world unto themselves. And then came the war that changed everything. The conflict that Americans would come to call the French and Indian War began quietly in the forests of the Ohio River Valley, where British colonists pushing westward for land and trade ran headlong into French claims that stretched from Canada southward to Louisiana. In May of 1754, a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington led a small force into the wilderness and ambushed a French scouting party at a place called Jumonville Glen. It was a small engagement in a remote corner of the continent, but the spark it struck would eventually set the world ablaze. France and Britain were already rivals across half the globe, and the confrontation in the Ohio Valley soon became part of a much larger conflict known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. The early years of the fighting went badly for Britain. General Braddock's disastrous expedition in 1755, cut apart on the Monongahela by French and native forces, exposed the vulnerability of European tactics in American wilderness. Fort William. Henry fell in 1757 in a siege that ended in massacre. The great fortress at Ticonderoga repelled a much larger British force in 1758, but the tide turned. The energetic leadership of William Pitt brought fresh resources and new resolve. The Forbes expedition of 1758 seized Fort Duquesne, opening the Ohio Valley at last. Louisburg fell. Fort Frontenac fell, cutting French supply lines. And then came the pivotal moment that would seal the fate of French North America, the daring assault on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec in September of 1759, where British forces under General James Wolfe the cliffs under cover of darkness and met the French army of General Montcalm in open battle. Both commanders fell, Quebec fell, and the following year, Montreal surrendered, ending French resistance in the north. The Treaty of Paris of February 10th, 1763, formalised what the battlefield had decided. France ceded all its territories in mainland North America east of the Mississippi River to Britain, Canada, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, all of it. Spain, which had entered the war on France's side, gave up Florida in exchange for the vast French lands west of the Mississippi. Britain emerged from the conflict as the dominant power in North America, but victory had come at an enormous cost. Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the war, rising from roughly £75 million in 1756 to about £133 million by 1763, an increase of nearly £60 million, straining the Crown's finances and demanding new sources of revenue. And the British government had a ready answer for where some of that revenue should come from. The colonies, they reasoned, had benefited from the war. They had been protected. A permanent British army was now to be stationed in North America to guard the new territories and keep the peace. Surely the colonists could contribute their fair share. It seemed, from London, like a perfectly sensible argument. But it was not so simple, because even before the first new tax was proposed, the Crown had already given the colonies reason for grievance. In October of 1763, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains and forbidding colonial settlement west of it. All dealings with the native peoples west of the mountains were to be handled by the Crown. Colonists who had fought in the war, who had dreamed of Western land, who had already invested in frontier speculation, men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, found themselves shut out. The proclamation was widely ignored, widely resented, and quietly fueled a growing suspicion that London did not truly have colonial interests at heart. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765. Parliament's first direct tax on the colonies required that a revenue stamp be purchased for an astonishing range of everyday items: legal documents, contracts, wills, marriage, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, almanacs, even playing cards and dice. The tax was to be paid in British sterling, a currency that was already scarce in the colonies, and the revenue it raised would go not to the colonial assemblies, but directly to the Crown. The reaction was swift, and it was furious. Colonists had long believed, and the assemblies had long practiced, that taxation was a matter for their own elected representatives to decide. They were not represented in the British Parliament. They could not vote on its decisions, and so they argued Parliament had no right to tax them. The principle was ancient, rooted in Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights of 1689. No taxation without representation. Lawyers and pamphleteers like James Otis and Daniel Dulaney put the argument into words. Patrick Henry, the fiery Virginia orator, put it before the House of Burgesses in the form of 7 resolutions that sent tremors through the colonial world. In Boston, the anger took a more physical form. The Sons of Liberty, a network of colonial patriots that had grown from a small group called the Loyal Nine, organised resistance with remarkable effectiveness. Led by figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, they gathered crowds at the Liberty Tree, published incendiary pamphlets in the Boston Gazette, and turned their fury on the men appointed to distribute the stamps. Tax collector Andrew Oliver was hung in effigy, his newly built house ransacked. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson's mansion was torn apart by a mob. Stamp distributors across the colonies were intimidated, threatened and compelled to resign. From Portsmouth to Savannah, the machinery of the Stamp Act ground to a halt. In October of 1765, representatives from 9 colonies gathered in New York City for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They produced a declaration of rights and grievances and sent petitions to the King and Parliament demanding repeal. And repeal came in 1766, driven largely by the damage that colonial boycotts were inflicting on British merchants. But Parliament could not resist one final assertion of authority. Alongside the repeal, it passed the Declaratory Act, insisting that it retained the power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The principle was preserved even as the immediate cause was conceded. The following year brought the Townshend Acts, a new package of import duties on glass, lead, paint, paper and tea. Once again, colonists organised. Non-importation agreements spread through New England and the Middle Colonies. John Dickinson's letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania rallied public opinion. Massachusetts issued a circular letter calling for unified resistance, and once again, the British response was to escalate rather than retreat. In 1768, 4,000 British soldiers arrived in Boston, dispatched to enforce the Townshend Acts and protect royal customs officials who had been harassed and threatened by colonial mobs. Boston did not welcome them. The soldiers were quartered in the city, red-coated and conspicuous, a daily reminder of imperial power. They competed with local labourers for work on the docks, fueling resentment. They patrolled streets where they were jeered, pelted with insults, and sometimes with worse. Colonists called them lobsterbacks. Tensions simmered through 1768 and 1769, low and persistent, like coals that refused to go cold. And then came the 5th of March, 1770. The night was cold, the streets dusted with snow. A crowd gathered outside the custom house surrounding a lone British sentry with insults and projectiles, snowballs, rocks, oyster shells. Captain Thomas Preston sent a small detachment of 8 soldiers to assist. The crowd pressed closer. Crispus Attucks, a dock worker of African and Native American ancestry, stood at the front of the mob. Someone fired. Then others fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 men lay dead or dying. Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Patrick Carr, and the young apprentice Samuel Maverick, just 17 years old. The event was immediately seized by Patriot leaders. Samuel Adams called it a massacre. Paul Revere produced a striking engraving showing British soldiers firing into a helpless crowd, the image printed in the Boston Gazette and distributed across the colonies as a broadside. The soldiers were tried for murder in colonial court, defended by the Patriot lawyer John Adams, who believed that even unpopular men deserved a fair trial. 6 were acquitted, 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. John Adams's willingness to take the case drew public anger, but ultimately deepened respect for his integrity, setting him on the path toward a remarkable political life. In the months that followed, Parliament quietly repealed most of the Townshend duties. All of them, that is, except the tax on tea. That one was kept deliberately as a statement of principle. The colonies fell into an uneasy quiet. Most of the non-importation agreements dissolved. Open protests subsided. But the grievances did not dissolve with them. Committees of correspondence formed in 1772, quietly weaving a network of shared ideas and shared anger across the colonies. Newspapers carried debates about sovereignty and representation and the nature of liberty. The calm was real, but it was thin, and beneath it something was still smouldering. Yet even after the blood of the Boston Massacre dried on the cobblestones, a fragile quiet returned to the colonies, a calm that would not last, for the most defiant act of colonial resistance was still to come. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. Tea, intolerable acts, and the road to war. There is a particular kind of tension that builds slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the pressure behind a dam that has held for years. It does not announce itself. It gathers quietly in grievances small and large, in the accumulation of indignities, in the slow erosion of trust between a people and the power that governs them. By the early 1770s, that pressure had been building in the American colonies for a very long time. And then came the tea. In May of 1773, the British Parliament passed the Tea Act, a measure designed on its surface to solve a rather practical problem. The British East India Company was struggling financially, burdened with enormous debts and warehouses overflowing with unsold tea. The solution Parliament devised was elegant in its simplicity. Allow the company to ship tea directly to the American colonies, bypassing the London auction entirely, eliminating middlemen, and relieving the company of its usual export duties in Britain. The retail price of tea in the colonies would actually fall. On paper it seemed like a gift, but the colonists saw something else entirely. The Tea Act granted the East India Company a government-sanctioned monopoly over the colonial tea trade, undercutting local merchants and smugglers who had long supplied Dutch tea to willing buyers. And crucially, the old Townshend tax, a 3p per pound duty on colonial tea, remained in place. The price might be lower, but every chest of East India tea still carried within it a fundamental claim, that Parliament held the right to tax the colonies without their consent. To accept the cheaper tea was, in a sense, to accept that claim silently. To many colonists, that was unacceptable. The principle of taxation without representation had already simmered through years of earlier disputes. Now it returned, wrapped in the familiar scent of tea leaves, and it found an audience ready to resist. In Boston, resistance took shape through the Sons of Liberty, a broad patriot coalition led by Samuel Adams, drawing together artisans, craftsmen, merchants, labourers, and men of standing alike. Figures such as John Hancock, Paul Revere, Dr. Joseph Warren, and Josiah Quincy gathered alongside ordinary tradesmen and apprentices, unified by a shared conviction that the Tea Act could not stand. The evening of December 16th, 1773 arrived cold and tense. At the Old South Meeting House, a large crowd had gathered to hear what Governor Thomas Hutchinson would decide regarding 3 East India Company ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor and the Beaver, sitting in Boston Harbour with their cargo of tea. Hutchinson refused to allow the ships to depart without unloading. His answer delivered, the meeting erupted. Somewhere between 30 and 60 men, many disguised as Mohawk Indians, surged from the hall and moved through the darkened streets toward Griffin's Wharf. There, quietly and with a kind of methodical resolve, they boarded the 3 ships and began their work. Chest after chest, roughly 342 in all, containing some 90,000 pounds of East India Company tea, valued at nearly £9,659 at the time, was hauled up from the holds and thrown into the cold waters of Boston Harbour. The destruction took several hours. By the time it was done, the surface of the harbour was thick with floating tea. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be known, was not a chaotic riot. It was a deliberate act of political defiance, carefully organised and carried out with remarkable discipline. Not a single other item aboard the ships was damaged. The act was pointed, precise and unmistakable in its meaning. Word reached London within weeks, and the reaction was swift. King George III, who had initially regarded colonial unrest as a temporary disturbance caused by troublemakers, grew increasingly alarmed as the scale of the destruction became clear. The British cabinet convened, debated, and ultimately chose not to prosecute individuals. Instead, it chose to punish an entire city. The result was a series of laws passed through Parliament in 1774, which the British called the Coercive Acts. and which the colonists almost immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts. Each measure struck at a different dimension of colonial life, and together they formed something the colonists had never faced before. A coordinated, deliberate dismantling of the rights and institutions they had long taken for granted. The Boston Port Act arrived first, enacted in late March 1774 and taking effect on the 1st of June. It closed the harbour of Boston to all shipping, no goods in, no goods out, until the city paid reparations for the destroyed tea. Naval vessels enforced the blockade. The economic consequences were immediate and severe. Merchant firms shuttered. Imports of food, clothing, and essential supplies ground to a halt. Unemployment spread through the city. Boston, one of the most prosperous ports in North America, was being slowly strangled. The Massachusetts Government Act struck even deeper. It effectively nullified the colony's 1691 charter, placing the government under direct royal control. The Governor's Council, previously elected, would now be appointed by the Crown. The governor gained sweeping authority to appoint and remove judges, sheriffs, and other officials. Town meetings, the living heart of New England civic life, the place where communities gathered to debate and decide their own affairs, were restricted to a single annual assembly, with any additional gathering requiring the governor's written permission. The colony's tradition of self-governance, built over more than a century, was being unmade by parliamentary decree. The Administration of Justice Act granted royal officials and soldiers accused of capital crimes in the colonies the right to be tried in England or another colony, wherever, it was implied, a sympathetic jury might be found. Colonists called it the Murder Act, and the name carried a specific memory. The soldiers of the Boston Massacre, tried in the colonies, had faced at least the form of local justice. Under this new law, that possibility was being removed. The Quartering Act of 1774 expanded on earlier legislation, authorising British officers to billet troops in uninhabited houses, outbuildings, and barns when barracks were insufficient, keeping soldiers in close proximity to the civilian population they were meant to suppress. And then there was the Quebec Act, technically a separate measure, but passed in the same session and received as part of the same assault. It extended Quebec's borders westward into the Ohio Valley, nullifying land claims held by several colonies and blocking westward expansion. It replaced English common law with French civil law in private matters, and it granted Catholics the freedom to worship and hold office without renouncing their faith, an accommodation that alarmed Protestant colonists already fearful of creeping arbitrary power. To many, it felt like one more piece in a deliberate design. Britain intended the coercive acts to isolate Massachusetts, to make an example of one rebellious colony and warn the others into compliance. The effect was precisely the opposite. As news of the Port Act spread through the colonies, something unexpected happened. Rather than pulling back, the other colonies moved closer. Food, supplies, and money flowed toward Boston from towns and counties across the continent. Committees of correspondence, networks of communication that had been quietly growing for years, carried information and coordination from colony to colony with new urgency. The message spreading through those networks was clear. What had happened to Massachusetts could happen to any of them. In September of 1774, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Georgia sent no representatives, but the rest, from New Hampshire in the north to South Carolina in the south, were present. Among them were John Adams and Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, George Washington and Patrick Henry of Virginia, John Jay of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Caesar Rodney of Delaware. Virginia's Peyton Randolph was elected to preside over the gathering. The First Continental Congress, as it would be remembered, produced several significant documents and decisions. The delegates adopted the Declaration and Resolves, which laid out colonial grievances and asserted the rights of the colonists as Englishmen. They endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, a set of resolutions from Massachusetts declaring the intolerable acts unconstitutional. And they created the Continental Association, a coordinated continent-wide boycott of British goods to take effect on December 1st, 1774, enforced by locally appointed committees in each colony. Merchants who violated the boycott faced public denunciation, social ostracism, and considerable pressure to comply. The delegates also sent a petition to King George III appealing for the repeal of the offensive measures and resolved to reconvene the following May if Britain did not respond. The king did not respond as the colonists hoped. Through the autumn and winter of 1774 and into 1775, something else was happening quietly in the countryside. Colonial militias, which had long existed as part-time community institutions, began to transform. In Massachusetts, the Provincial Congress ordered the purchase of muskets, cannon, powder, and provisions. Towns were directed to raise alarm companies and minuteman companies, units of younger, more able-bodied men who pledged to be ready to mobilize at a moment's notice, keeping their weapons close and drilling with regularity. Worcester County established the first of these minuteman companies in September 1774. The model spread rapidly across Massachusetts and then into other colonies. Virginia's counties began organizing volunteer companies. Rhode Island and Connecticut ordered regular drills. Maryland called on all men between 16 and 50 to form companies and master military exercises. A quarter of Massachusetts's militia force was reorganized on this new model. Men who had given their word to appear armed and ready whenever the call came. In Boston, British General Thomas Gage watched all of this with growing concern. Intelligence reports reached him describing significant caches of weapons, ammunition, and military stores gathered by the colonial militia in the town of Concord, roughly 18 miles to the northwest. Gage had been directed from London to enforce the intolerable acts and suppress the rebellion taking shape around him. He made his decision, a swift, secret march to Concord to seize and destroy those supplies before they could be used. The plan did not remain secret for long. On the night of April 18, 1775, Dr. Joseph Warren, one of Boston's most prominent Patriot leaders, dispatched riders to carry warning of the British advance. Two men set out by different routes. Paul Revere left his home shortly after 10 in the evening, using a pre-arranged lantern signal from the Old North Church to confirm that the British troops were crossing the Charles River by boat. William Dawes rode out by a land route through the Boston Neck. The two men met in Lexington, where they warned John Hancock and Samuel Adams to flee. They then continued westward, joined by a young Concord physician named Samuel Prescott. A British patrol intercepted the three riders. Revere was briefly captured and later released on foot. Dawes's horse threw him. But Prescott slipped through the patrol and rode on to Concord, delivering the warning that the British were coming. Along the roads and through the darkened villages, other riders spread the alarm as well, and by the first hours of April 19th, militia companies across the region were rousing themselves and reaching for their muskets. The British column, roughly 700 regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, marched through the night and reached Lexington as dawn was breaking. On the town green, Captain John Parker had assembled approximately 77 Minutemen. They were outnumbered many times over. Major John Pitcairn's advance troops rode up and ordered the colonists to disperse. Then a shot was fired. Who fired it remains uncertain even now. British officers who were present reported that the colonists fired first. Witnesses on the colonial side told different stories. Historians have examined the testimony from both sides carefully and concluded that the question cannot be definitively resolved. the shot's origin remains, as it has always been, one of history's quiet mysteries. What followed the shot is not in dispute. British troops opened a volley. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen lay dead on the Lexington Green, and 10 more were wounded. 1 British soldier had been grazed. The brief clash, lasting perhaps 15 or 20 minutes, ended with the colonial men retreating and the British pressing on toward Concord. At Concord, the British found some of the stored supplies and began their work of destruction. But while they searched the town, the militia was gathering. Roughly 400 Minutemen and militia assembled at the North Bridge on the edge of town and advanced in formation toward approximately 90 British regulars who'd crossed the bridge to secure it. A brief exchange of shots, spurred by Major John Buttrick's order to fire, left 3 British soldiers dead and 9 wounded. 2 colonists were killed, 4 wounded. The British troops fell back toward Concord. The regulars began their long march back to Boston. What awaited them on that road would become one of the most consequential retreats in military history. From behind stone walls, hedgerows, farm buildings, and the gentle rises of the New England landscape, colonial militiamen appeared in numbers the British had not anticipated. They struck at Merriam's Corner and again at Brooks Hill. They poured fire into the column at a tight curve in the road that soldiers would later call the Bloody Angle, where 2 volleys converged from different directions at once. At Fisk Hill and along the Lincoln-Lexington line, thousands of men massed behind trees and fences, fired, shifted, and fired again. The British, forced to reload, to press forward under relentless musket fire, to carry their wounded, moved through an 8-mile gauntlet that did not relent. When the exhausted column finally reached the safety of Charlestown and British naval cover, the toll was staggering. The British suffered 300 casualties in total, 73 killed, 174 wounded, 53 missing or captured. The colonial forces lost 93 men, 49 killed, 39 wounded, 5 missing or captured. The expedition had failed to suppress the rebellion. The stored supplies at Concord had largely been hidden or moved before the British arrived. And the regulars, some of the most disciplined soldiers in the world, had been driven back across the Massachusetts countryside by farmers and tradesmen who had spent months quietly preparing for exactly this moment. News of the battles travelled fast. Within days, dispatches were moving south by post rider and express courier. By April 24th, reports reached Philadelphia. By April 29th, they had arrived in Williamsburg, Virginia. Newspapers carried the accounts from Boston to Connecticut, to Rhode Island, to Delaware, to the Carolinas. Everywhere the news arrived, it produced the same effect. Towns held assemblies, counties levied taxes for arms, men enlisted in militia companies, and resolutions were passed pledging resistance. Philadelphia's streets filled with the sound of drums. Delaware formed dozens of companies within days. Virginia's leaders connected the battles to recent British seizures of colonial gunpowder. Along the North Carolina coast, voices declared that the sword had been drawn. What had begun as a contest of principle, over tea, over taxation, over the question of who held the right to govern, had now become something different. The shots fired at Lexington and Concord had announced to the world that the colonies would resist with blood, and now the Second Continental Congress faced the greatest question of all. Was this still a fight to restore British rights, or had the moment come to declare something far more permanent? Chapter 3: Declaring Independence, the Birth of a Nation in the Fire of War. In the spring of 1775, as the echoes of Lexington and Concord still lingered over the Massachusetts countryside, the representatives of 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The city was warm and alive with the hum of urgent voices, and the weight of history pressed gently but unmistakably upon every room. This was the Second Continental Congress, convening on the 10th of May, 1775, a gathering that would quietly, steadily transform itself from a body of colonial delegates into something the world had never quite seen before, a provisional government for a people who were not yet certain they wished to become a nation. Georgia had not yet sent representatives, but the others had come, and they'd come with purpose. The Congress coordinated the war effort, issued petitions, debated strategy, and managed the fragile, improbable machinery of a revolution still finding its shape. One of its earliest and most consequential decisions was the creation of the Continental Army, and with it, the appointment of a commander. The man chosen was George Washington of Virginia. He had served as a colonel during the French and Indian War, earning a quiet but steady reputation for competence, for coolness under pressure, and for the kind of steadiness that soldiers lean into when everything around them is uncertain. He had managed the vast estate of Mount Vernon for decades, demonstrating the organisational patience that armies demand. He had served in the Virginia House of Burgesses and attended the First Continental Congress, and so he understood not only the battlefield but the careful, cautious world of colonial politics. The choice was not only military, it was deeply political. The delegates needed a man who could hold the colonies together, who could bridge the distance between New England and the South, between merchants and farmers, between the bold and the hesitant. A Virginian of Washington's stature and reputation seemed to promise all of that. His personal character, his known integrity, his Republican modesty, his willingness to serve rather than to rule, made him the consensus choice that no one could reasonably dispute. And so, in the early summer of 1775, George Washington became the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. But the Congress was not yet ready to call this war what it was. Even as Washington prepared to take command, the delegates drafted a document that expressed something quieter, something almost hopeful, a final letter to their king. The Olive Branch Petition, adopted on the 5th of July and signed on the 8th, was addressed to King George III. It affirmed colonial loyalty. It requested the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. It asked gently for the king to intervene and find a path toward peace. The petition never received a reply. By the time it reached London, the blood of Bunker Hill had already dried. The Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought on the 17th of June, 1775, on the hills above Charlestown, Massachusetts, during the ongoing Siege of Boston. Roughly 2,400 colonial militiamen had occupied and fortified a redoubt on Breed's Hill, overlooking the harbour. The British sent approximately 3,000 regulars against them in 3 successive assaults up this hillside. The militiamen, many of them farmers and tradesmen, held their ground with extraordinary discipline. They fired carefully, conserving powder, and the British lines broke twice before finally cresting the heights on the third advance when American ammunition was nearly exhausted. The British had taken the hill, but the cost had been devastating. Approximately 1,054 British casualties compared to roughly 450 American losses. It was the most costly single engagement the Redcoats would endure in the entire Revolutionary War. Back in London, when King George III learned of the casualties, the hope of a swift and easy suppression of the colonial rebellion quietly died. And when the Olive Branch Petition arrived in that same atmosphere of alarm and frustration, the king responded not with negotiation, but with a proclamation of rebellion, issued on the 23rd of August 1775, declaring the colonies to be in open defiance of the Crown. The door to peaceful resolution had closed. In the months that followed, the Congress authorised an ambitious and ultimately tragic operation, an invasion of Canada. The goal was to bring the French-speaking inhabitants into the revolutionary cause to seize the strategic cities of Montreal and Quebec, and perhaps to welcome a 14th colony into the fold. Montreal fell in November 1775, but Quebec held. On the last night of December, in the bitter cold of a Canadian winter, Generals Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold launched a night assault on the city's walls. Montgomery was killed, Arnold was wounded. The assault failed. The campaign then unravelled slowly and painfully, and battered by disease, by the cold, by expiring enlistments and dwindling supplies, by the deep indifference of a Catholic French-speaking population that had little reason to trust the Protestant colonists who had arrived uninvited at their doors. When British reinforcements arrived in the spring of 1776 under Governor Guy Carleton, the Americans retreated. By June, the invasion had collapsed entirely. Canada would not join the revolution. Yet even as that northern dream faded, something remarkable was happening in Boston. Washington had been laying plans through the long winter months, waiting for the right moment and the right tools. Henry Knox, a young bookseller turned artillery officer, had performed a feat of extraordinary determination, hauling dozens of heavy cannons from the captured Fort Ticonderoga across frozen lakes and snow-covered mountains, dragging them on sleds through the New York wilderness and into the Massachusetts hills. On the night of March 4th, 1776, Washington set his plan in motion. Under cover of darkness, while a bombardment elsewhere drew British attention, approximately 800 soldiers and 1,200 labourers moved quietly to Dorchester Heights, the commanding hills south of Boston Harbour. By morning, cannon batteries looked down over the city and the British fleet below. General William Howe, commanding the British garrison, understood immediately what had happened. The city was exposed. A storm prevented any counterattack. With no viable defence remaining, Howe ordered the evacuation. On the 17th of March 1776, roughly 11,000 British troops and approximately 1,000 Loyalists sailed from Boston to Halifax. The siege was over. The first major campaign of the Revolutionary War had ended in American success. Washington's leadership and Knox's cannons had made it possible. The mood in the colonies was shifting. Something deeper than military calculation was stirring in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. A growing sense that the break with Britain was not merely necessary but right, not merely practical but just. And into that swelling current of feeling came a small pamphlet, published anonymously in Philadelphia on the 10th of January 1776. Thomas Paine had arrived in the colonies from England only 2 years earlier, but he had absorbed the grievances of the colonial world with remarkable swiftness and distilled them into language that cut through every hesitation. Common sense argued plainly and powerfully that monarchy itself was an absurd and corrupt institution, that hereditary rule served no legitimate purpose, and that the British government had subjected the colonies to a pattern of tyranny that no loyal subject should be asked to endure. It argued that the colonies possessed the natural right to govern themselves, that a republican system built on equality and consent would be far more just and prosperous than dependence on a distant crown, and that independence was not merely desirable, it was morally necessary. The pamphlet sold tens of thousands of copies within the first months. By year's end, estimates suggested that hundreds of thousands of copies had circulated throughout the colonies. It was read aloud in taverns and churches and meeting halls, reaching even those who could not read for themselves. Paine's prose was clear and urgent and deeply human, and it moved people from ambivalence toward conviction. Common sense did not create the revolution, but it voiced what the revolution had been quietly becoming. In June of 1776, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a formal resolution before the Continental Congress, calling for independence, foreign alliances, and a framework for confederation. John Adams seconded it. The debates that followed were intense and careful. Not every colony was yet ready, and the Congress moved cautiously, postponing the final vote while delegates consulted their home assemblies. When the vote came at last, on the 2nd of July, it carried. The colonies had chosen independence. A committee had already been formed to draft the formal declaration. 5 men, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The committee members voted among themselves for who should write the first draft. Jefferson received the most votes. Adams, who had encouraged the choice, praised Jefferson's elegance and his reputation among the delegates. Jefferson, 33 years old and the youngest of the 5, took up the task and completed his draft in a matter of days. Jefferson drew on deep philosophical waters. The natural rights theory of John Locke, particularly the idea that all people possess unalienable rights, and that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, flowed through the document's most celebrated lines. Jefferson also drew on Montesquieu, on Cicero, on Aristotle, and on the very recent work of George Mason, whose Virginia Declaration of Rights served as a close template. The result was a document that opened with a preamble of quiet moral grandeur, before moving into a long list of 27 specific grievances against King George III, taxes without representation, the quartering of soldiers, the suppression of colonial assemblies, the waging of war against the very people a king was meant to protect. The Congress edited the draft carefully, and at times extensively, cutting roughly a quarter of the original text. One passage in particular, Jefferson's 168-word condemnation of the transatlantic slave trade, which he had described as a cruel war against human nature, was removed entirely. Southern delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, whose plantation economies depended on enslaved labor, objected. Northern merchants who profited from trade also resisted. The passage was struck. In its place, a narrower grievance about the king's incitement of domestic insurrections remained. The contradiction at the heart of a declaration of universal human freedom would endure, unresolved, for generations. On the 4th of July 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence. The engrossed parchment was signed beginning on the 2nd of August. Printed broadsides were dispatched across the colonies within days. On the 8th of July, a public reading was held in Philadelphia's State House yard at noon, and the words carried out over the crowd gathered below. Similar readings followed in town squares and church halls and military camps from Massachusetts to Georgia. King George III's statue was pulled down in New York. Its bronze was melted into musket balls. A nation had declared itself into existence, but declarations alone could not hold back the British Army. General William Howe had returned with a massive force, some 20,000 men, including Hessian soldiers, transported by a fleet that crowded New York Harbor. The campaign that followed through the summer and autumn of 1776 was a long and painful sequence of American retreats. At the Battle of Long Island on the 27th of August, Howe executed a devastating flanking maneuver through the lightly defended Jamaica Pass, routing the Continental left wing and forcing Washington back to fortified positions on Brooklyn Heights. What followed was one of Washington's most extraordinary acts of the entire war. On the night of August 29th and into the morning of the 30th, under a covering fog, he ordered every available boat into the East River. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, piloted the craft through the dark water while wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth and fires were left burning on the heights to deceive British sentries. By dawn, roughly 9,000 men, along with their artillery and supplies, had crossed to Manhattan without the loss of a single life. The army had survived, but the losses continued. Fort Washington fell in November. Fort Lee fell soon after. Washington's army retreated across New Jersey in the cold of late autumn, exhausted, underfed, poorly clothed, dwindling in number as enlistments expired and desertions mounted. By December of 1776, fewer than 3,000 experienced troops remained under his command. Many had no shoes, many had no coats. The revolution that had been declared with such solemn eloquence in July seemed, in the grey chill of December, to be quietly dying in the fields of New Jersey. It was in this hour that Thomas Paine produced another piece of writing, the first of a series of pamphlets he called The American Crisis, published on the 19th of December, 1776. It began with words that Washington ordered read aloud to his troops. "These are the times that try men's souls." The words passed through the camps like a quiet fire. On the night of Christmas, 1776, Washington moved. In bitter cold, through driving sleet and snow, with ice floes grinding against the sides of their boats, approximately 2,400 Continental soldiers crossed the Delaware River. The crossing took hours. The men were cold and wet and silent. On the far bank they formed into columns and marched through the darkness toward Trenton, New Jersey, where a garrison of roughly 1,400 to 1,500 Hessian soldiers was stationed. At dawn on the 26th of December, the Americans struck from multiple directions, with artillery rolling into position and infantry pressing in from the roads. The Hessians, unprepared and off guard, were overwhelmed. Nearly 1,000 were captured. 3 Americans were killed, 6 wounded. It was swift, it was decisive, and it was desperately needed. A week later, on the 3rd of January 1777, Washington moved again, north toward Princeton, where he struck the British 4th Brigade in a sharp engagement that sent the enemy retreating toward New York. Washington himself rode into the fighting, rallying his men as British and American lines exchanged fire at close range. The British withdrew. Nassau Hall was captured. New Jersey, for most of its length, was freed of British occupation. The effect on the Continental Army was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had been about to leave re-enlisted. Fresh volunteers arrived. The public, which had begun to doubt whether the revolution could survive its first terrible year, found reason to believe again. Washington's leadership had steadied a cause that had nearly come undone. The Continental Army had survived its darkest hour, but survival alone could not win the war. And in the year that followed, one extraordinary battle would change not just the fate of the revolution, but the entire balance of power in the Atlantic world. Chapter 4: Saratoga and the French Alliance. The Revolution Goes Global. In the long, quiet corridors of history, certain moments arrive not with the thunder of a single cannon, but with the slow, irreversible turning of something vast and ancient, like the shifting of a river that will never again run in its former course. The year 1777 was such a moment for the American Revolution, and it began, as so many things did in that era, with a plan drawn on paper far from the blood and mud of the battlefield. The British had not abandoned their ambition to end the rebellion swiftly. Their strategy for 1777 was elegant in its design, if brutal in its intention. 3 armies would move in coordinated arcs through the American interior, converging on the Hudson River Valley and severing New England, the perceived heart of colonial resistance, from the rest of the colonies. General John Burgoyne would lead the northern prong, descending southward from Canada with a force of roughly 8,000 soldiers. A secondary column under Colonel Barry St. Leger would push eastward through the Mohawk Valley, and General William Howe, positioned in New York City, would drive northwards to complete the encirclement. Together they would close like a hand around the rebellion's throat. General John Burgoyne was a man of many lives. Soldier, playwright, politician, and socialite, he moved through the gilded rooms of London society with a theatrical confidence that earned him the affectionate and slightly mocking nickname of Gentleman Johnny. He was charming and daring, fond of fine clothes and high stakes, the kind of man who treated war as though it were another grand performance. And in the summer of 1777, he led his army southward from Quebec with the quiet certainty of a man who expects the curtain to rise in his favour. His route carved through the wilderness of the north. From the Canadian city of Saint John, his force moved down the Lake Champlain corridor, seizing Fort Ticonderoga and the adjacent Fort Independence without great difficulty. Then onward, across Lake George, through the rough terrain near Skenesborough, southward to Fort Edward on the Hudson, and finally down the long valley toward Albany, where he expected to be met by Howe's army marching from the south. But Howe did not come. General William Howe had made a different calculation. He believed that capturing Philadelphia, the American capital, would deliver a decisive blow, that seizing the seat of the Continental Congress would shatter colonial morale and perhaps end the war in a single season. And so, rather than marching northward to meet Burgoyne, he turned his army south toward Pennsylvania. Personal doubts about coordinating two large forces through rugged terrain, and perhaps something of a rivalry with Burgoyne himself, further cemented his decision. The grand three-pronged strategy quietly collapsed into two separate campaigns moving in opposite directions. Howe's campaign bore fruit, at least in a narrow sense. On the 11th of September 1777, British and Hessian forces met Washington's Continental Army along the banks of Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. It was the largest single-day land battle of the Revolution, lasting 11 hours under a late summer sky. Howe's forces outmaneuvered the Americans, forcing a costly retreat and leaving the road to Philadelphia unguarded. 2 weeks later, on the 26th of September, British soldiers marched into the revolutionary capital largely unopposed. Loyalists celebrated, the Continental Congress fled, and for a brief season, it seemed as though Howe's gamble had paid off. But far to the north, along the wooded ridgelines above the Hudson River, a different story was taking shape. Burgoyne's army, now deep in American territory and without the support of Howe's forces, found itself slowing to a crawl. The wilderness was unforgiving. Supply lines stretched thin. The surrounding countryside was not the Loyalist haven the British had anticipated. And waiting for him on the high ground of Bemis Heights was an American army under General Horatio Gates, a British-born officer who had crossed the Atlantic to serve the colonial cause. On the 19th of September 1777, Burgoyne's forces moved in 3 columns through the forested hills near the farm of a man named John Freeman. This was the first great engagement of the Saratoga campaign, a 4-hour battle fought across open fields and tangled woodland. Leading the American riflemen on the forward lines was Colonel Daniel Morgan, whose marksmen had already proven their worth in a dozen engagements. From concealed positions in the trees, they targeted British officers with a precision that unnerved and disrupted the enemy's command. The sounds of that afternoon, rifles cracking, commands shouted through smoke, men falling in the tall grass, were sounds Burgoyne soldiers would not soon forget. Also present, commanding with fierce energy on the American side, was General Benedict Arnold. His relationship with Gates was strained. A dispute over command had technically removed him from the field. But Arnold was not a man who stood still while a battle raged. His instincts and boldness helped direct the American resistance through the confusion of the afternoon. The British held the ground at day's end. In the narrow sense of territorial possession, it was a British tactical victory, but at what cost? Over 1,000 British casualties against perhaps 300 American. Burgoyne had failed to dislodge the entrenched Americans, and his advance toward Albany had effectively stalled. He waited. He had little choice but to wait, still hoping that relief from Howe or from some other quarter might yet arrive, but none came. His army grew weaker, supplies dwindled, the days grew shorter as autumn settled over the Hudson Valley. Then, on the 7th of October, Burgoyne attempted one final push, a reconnaissance in force against the American positions on Bemis Heights. It would become the decisive engagement of the entire campaign. Once again, Morgan's riflemen were there, occupying the high ground on the American right flank, picking off British officers one by one. Among the targets that day was General Simon Fraser, a capable and respected British commander whose fall demoralised his men and threw the British advance into disarray. And once again, Benedict Arnold appeared on the battlefield, defying his removal from field command, riding into the fighting with a reckless and arguably brilliant intensity. He led assaults against British redoubts, broke through their lines, and was struck by a musket ball that shattered his leg. The wound ended his part in the battle, but not before his actions had contributed directly to the collapse of Burgoyne's position. The British withdrew, the battle was over, and with it, so was the campaign. On the 17th of October 1777, General John Burgoyne, the playwright-turned-general, the gentleman Johnny who had descended from Canada with such confident swagger, surrendered his army at Saratoga. Approximately 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms. Under the terms of the Convention of Saratoga, the army was to be permitted free passage back to Britain on the condition that they would not serve again in North America during the war. The soldiers marched out with the honours of war, stacked their weapons, and began the long journey toward captivity, for Congress would later suspend the convention's terms, and most of the surrendered troops remained prisoners for the remainder of the conflict. It was the largest British defeat in living memory, and its echoes would reach far beyond the Hudson Valley. In Paris, the news arrived in early December of 1777. Benjamin Franklin had been living and working in the French capital since 1776, serving as the American diplomatic representative, a role that suited him with remarkable elegance. He was already celebrated in France as a philosopher, scientist, and wit. He had played the part of a plain, wise American sage with a skill that masked considerable political sophistication. But for all his charm and all his negotiations, the French government had been cautious. They were willing to offer covert support, money, supplies, quiet loans, but a formal alliance was another matter entirely. Saratoga changed everything. King Louis XVI, informed of the American victory, was reportedly delighted. France's foreign minister, the Comte de Rochambeau, saw in Burgoyne's surrender the proof he had been waiting for. The Americans could fight. They could defeat a professional European army in the field. They were a viable partner, and more importantly, they represented an extraordinary opportunity to weaken Britain. The old rival whose humiliating victories in the 7 Years' War had never been forgotten or forgiven. France's motivations were not entirely altruistic. The 7 Years' War had stripped France of much of its colonial empire and left a wound of national pride that had never fully healed. Supporting the American rebellion was a way to reclaim influence, to challenge British maritime dominance, to strike at the Sugar Islands and trade routes that made Britain wealthy. Revenge and geopolitical ambition moved alongside genuine sympathy for the American cause. On the 6th of February 1778, France and the United States formally signed the Treaty of Alliance and the Treaty of Amity and Commerce in Paris. France committed to providing military assistance, troops, naval forces, financial aid, and the two nations pledged mutual support. The revolution was no longer simply a colonial struggle. It had become something far larger. Among those who had already crossed the Atlantic to serve that cause was a young French aristocrat barely 20 years old. The Marquis de Lafayette, born Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier, had arrived on American soil in June of 1777, volunteering his service with an idealism that would endear him to General George Washington as though he were a son. Lafayette would go on to serve in Virginia at Brandywine and finally at Yorktown, becoming one of the most celebrated figures of the entire war on both sides of the ocean. But the winter between the triumph of Saratoga and the promise of the French alliance was perhaps the most difficult the Continental Army had ever known. Washington had moved his forces into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a defensible plateau roughly 18 miles northwest of Philadelphia, near the Schuylkill River. They arrived in December of 1777, and what followed was an ordeal that tested the very limits of human endurance. The soldiers built crude log huts, 14 by 16 feet, cramped and drafty and barely sufficient against the cold. Food was desperately scarce. Rations fell to half a pound of beef per man in January, and there were days in February when there was no meat at all. Thousands of men lacked adequate shoes and clothing. Many were barefoot in the snow. Disease moved through the camp relentlessly. Influenza, typhus, typhoid, dysentery. And before the winter ended, roughly 2,000 men had died, nearly 1 in 6 of the more than 12,000 who had entered the encampment. And yet Valley Forge was not only a place of suffering, it was also a place of transformation. In the early months of 1778, a Prussian officer arrived at the camp with a letter of introduction and an offer of service. Baron Friedrich von Steuben had served as an aide to Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, and he brought with him a lifetime of professional military knowledge. Appointed temporary Inspector General of the Continental Army, he began immediately to reshape what he found. He organised a model company of 120 men drawn from Washington's personal guard, drilling them personally and patiently through the cold mornings. He trained select sergeants to become instructors, then spread the new methods through the entire army. He taught the soldiers to march in step, to load and fire in coordinated volleys, to execute precise battlefield maneuvers, and to use the bayonet effectively, a skill American soldiers had previously lacked. He imposed stricter standards of sanitation and supply management. He wrote, with considerable help from translators, the document that would become known as the Blue Book, a comprehensive manual of military drill and discipline that the United States Army would rely upon until 1814. The men who emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 were not the same army that had entered it. They were leaner, harder, and far better trained. The proof came quickly. In late June of 1778, as British General Henry Clinton, who had replaced the resigned Howe in command of British forces, evacuated Philadelphia and moved his army across New Jersey toward New York, Washington's forces intercepted them at Monmouth. The Battle of Monmouth, fought on a sweltering summer day on the 28th of June, ended without a decisive tactical result. Clinton's army continued its march and reached New York, but it demonstrated something that had never been fully demonstrated before. The Continental Army could stand and fight on equal terms with British regulars in open field combat. Disciplined volleys, coordinated manoeuvres, orderly retreats and counterattacks. British observers noted the change with something approaching respect. Clinton's evacuation of Philadelphia itself told a quiet story about the revolution's shifting fortunes. With the French fleet now capable of threatening the Atlantic coastline, maintaining an inland garrison in a city far from naval protection had become untenable. The British retreated to New York, consolidating around the harbour, anchored to the sea. The war that had once felt like a manageable colonial rebellion was becoming something far more dangerous, and it was about to become more dangerous still. On the 21st of June 1779, Spain formally declared war on Great Britain, motivated by the desire to reclaim Gibraltar, Minorca, and Florida, territories lost in earlier conflicts, and to align with France against their common rival. Then in December of 1780, Britain found itself at war with the Dutch Republic as well, after Dutch merchants had spent years quietly supplying the American cause through the island of St. Eustatius and other channels. The Dutch Republic joined the League of Armed Neutrality and formally concluded a treaty of friendship with the United States in 1782. Britain, once the master of the Atlantic world, now faced enemies on nearly every horizon. French naval forces threatened the Sugar Islands of the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, Dominica. A combined Franco-Spanish fleet menaced Gibraltar and Minorca. The need to defend India, the Atlantic trade routes, the home islands themselves, all competed for the same ships, the same soldiers, the same treasury. The British military, once focused on crushing a rebellion in its North American colonies, was now stretched across the globe, fighting a war on terms it had never anticipated, and against adversaries it could not afford to underestimate. What had begun as a colonial dispute over taxation and representation had, through the forge of Saratoga and the diplomacy of Paris, grown into something the world had rarely seen, a revolutionary conflict that shook the foundations of empire itself. With France now at war with Britain and the revolution transformed into a global conflict, Britain shifted its strategy southward. But the war that awaited them there would prove far more complex, brutal, and ultimately unwinnable than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 5: The Southern War and the Forgotten. Struggle, revolution as civil war. There is a version of the American Revolution that unfolds neatly. Declarations signed, battles won. A new nation born from the courage of united colonists. But the deeper truth is far more tangled, far more human, and in many ways far more sorrowful. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the South, where the revolution did not simply pit Americans against the British Empire. It set neighbour against neighbour, tore communities apart and drew into its current the lives of enslaved men and women, of native nations, of wives and daughters, of people whose stories rarely found their way into the histories that followed. To understand how the war arrived in the South with such ferocity, one must first understand why Britain turned its gaze there. After the staggering defeat at Saratoga in 1777 and the entry of France into the conflict on the American side, British commanders reconsidered everything. The broad strategy of suppressing the entire rebellion by force had not worked. Something else was needed, and so the Crown settled upon what historians have called the Southern Strategy, a calculated pivot toward the colonies of Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, where planners in London believed the conditions were more favourable. The plantation economy of the South fed the lucrative West Indian trade. Local agriculture could sustain British armies in the field. And perhaps most importantly, British commanders believed the southern population harboured a larger proportion of loyal subjects, men who would take up arms for the crown if only given the opportunity and the protection to do so. In this belief they were not entirely wrong, but they were not entirely right either. The opening move came quietly, on a December day in 1778, along the marshy edges of Savannah, Georgia. A British force of roughly 3,500 men, under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, landed near the city and moved against the American garrison commanded by General Robert Howe. Howe's defenders numbered fewer than 900. The disparity in strength made the outcome swift and certain. Savannah fell on December 29, 1778, and the British occupation of the city would endure for years, until July of 1782. It was a quiet beginning to a campaign that would grow far louder. The loss of Savannah was painful, but what followed in the spring of 1780 was catastrophic. Charleston, South Carolina, the largest and most prosperous city in the South, became the next target. General Sir Henry Clinton crossed the Ashley River on the 29th of March 1780, and the British methodically encircled the city, cutting off every land and water route until an escape became impossible. The force Clinton brought to bear was enormous, roughly 12,800 regulars and militia, supported by sailors, ships of the line, and frigates. Inside the city, General Benjamin Lincoln commanded a garrison of approximately 5,000 men. Lincoln's defenders held as long as they could, relying on the earthworks and the guns of Fort Moultrie. But Fort Moultrie fell on the 7th of May. Heated shot rained down upon the town, and on the 12th of May 1780, Benjamin Lincoln surrendered his entire command and more than 5,000 soldiers, sailors and militia, along with artillery, ammunition and supplies. It was the largest American surrender of the entire Revolutionary War, a catastrophe from which the Patriot cause in the South would spend years trying to recover. Yet even in the shadow of that collapse, the South did not go silent. It would not be governed easily. In the weeks that followed Charleston's fall, a man named Francis Marion slipped away into the low country wilderness of South Carolina. He had escaped the siege, and from the swamps and rivers and dense forests of the Carolina interior, he began to assemble something the British could not easily fight, a ghost army of 20 to 70 men, fast-moving and invisible, striking at supply convoys and isolated outposts before vanishing back into the marshes. Marion gathered intelligence from local civilians. He split his forces to stretch the enemy thin. He rode at night. He attacked where he was least expected. The British called him the Swamp Fox, and the name captured something true. He was elusive, patient, and dangerous in ways that conventional warfare could not measure. Marion was not alone. Thomas Sumter and Andrew Pickens led their own partisan forces across the Carolina backcountry, each man weaving a web of disruption that made the British occupation costly in ways that no single battle could quantify. Together, these men transformed the South into a place that defied easy governance, precisely the condition that the Continental Army's new Southern commander would seek to cultivate and sustain. That commander was Nathanael Greene. Greene arrived in the South in late 1780, appointed by George Washington to take charge of a shattered and demoralized Continental force. He was a Rhode Island-born man, quietly determined, with a gift for logistics and an instinct for the geometry of war that few of his contemporaries possessed. Washington trusted him more than any other subordinate, and the trust was well placed. Greene understood that he could not defeat the British in open battle, not yet. His army was too small, too exhausted, too thinly supplied. What he could do was keep it alive. He could move it. He could stretch the British across hundreds of miles of hostile territory and make every garrison they held an island that required constant defense and resupply. He would coordinate with Marion and the other partisan leaders, creating a war of relentless, grinding pressure that the British could neither ignore nor decisively answer. His goal was to make the South ungovernable for the Crown, but before Greene could truly set his design in motion, the tide had already begun to shift in the hills of the Carolina backcountry on a ridge called Kings Mountain. On the 7th of October 1780, roughly 900 Patriot militiamen, many of them backwoods fighters from west of the Appalachian Mountains, descended upon a force of approximately 1,100 Loyalist troops commanded by British Major Patrick Ferguson. The fighting lasted barely an hour. Ferguson was killed. Most of his men surrendered. The remainder suffered heavy casualties. The Battle of Kings Mountain shattered Loyalist power in the Carolina interior and forced General Cornwallis to abandon his planned invasion of North Carolina. The men who fought there were not Continental regulars. They were farmers and hunters and frontier settlers, men who had ridden days to reach the battlefield because they believed the stakes were high enough to demand it. This was the nature of the Southern War. It was intimate and fierce and deeply personal. Cornwallis had arrived in the South confident in the strategy he carried from London. He was a capable commander, methodical and experienced, and his early successes seemed to confirm British expectations. In August of 1780, at the Battle of Camden, his forces destroyed an American army under General Horatio Gates, the same Gates celebrated as the hero of Saratoga. At Camden, however, Gates's militia broke and fled when they met British regulars, leaving the Continental line exposed and overwhelmed. More than 2,000 American casualties were inflicted. General Johann de Kalb was mortally wounded. Gates himself retreated so rapidly that the episode became a subject of bitter mockery. Camden was a disaster, yet disasters in this war had a way of generating responses, and the response that followed Camden was one of the most tactically elegant actions of the entire conflict. In January of 1781, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan met Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's British force at a place called Cowpens, a broad open pasture in South Carolina used for grazing cattle. Tarleton was aggressive and experienced, commanding roughly 1,000 men, including seasoned regulars and feared cavalry. Morgan had approximately 2,000 men, a mix of Continental soldiers and militia. Rather than fearing the militia's tendency to break under pressure, Morgan designed his battle around it. He placed his riflemen at the front to fire and fall back. Behind them, militia would deliver 2 volleys and then retire, not in panic, but as part of the plan. Behind the militia stood the Continental regulars on high ground, steady and waiting. When Tarleton's men advanced and the militia appeared to flee, the British pursued eagerly, rushing into a Continental line that held firm. Then Morgan's cavalry swung around from the flanks. The result was a double envelopment of stunning precision. Tarleton lost roughly 110 men killed, and over 800 captured or wounded. American casualties were 12 dead and 61 wounded. Cowpens was a masterpiece, and its effects rippled far beyond the battlefield. Cornwallis, stripped of a significant portion of his fighting strength, pressed deeper into North Carolina in pursuit of Greene's elusive army. The two forces finally met in a formal engagement at Guilford Courthouse on the 15th of March 1781. Cornwallis held roughly 21 to 2,400 men. Greene commanded nearly 4,400. Greene arrayed them as Morgan had done at Cowpens, 3 successive lines designed to bleed the British advance before they ever reached the Continental Corps. The British drove through each line and claimed the field. On paper, it was a British victory. In every meaningful sense, it was not. Cornwallis lost perhaps a quarter of his entire army at Guilford Courthouse. His experienced regulars fell in numbers he could not replace. His men were exhausted, undersupplied, and unable to pursue Greene's force, which remained intact enough to continue the campaign. The British general withdrew to Wilmington to recover. Greene turned south to harass the remaining British garrisons scattered across South Carolina and Georgia. The Southern strategy was not simply failing, it was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. And yet the war in the South was not only a war between armies. Beneath the movements of generals and the clash of formations ran currents of conflict that were older, deeper, and more painful. Among those currents was the question of slavery. In November of 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, had issued a proclamation that shook the foundations of the Southern social order. It promised freedom to any enslaved person owned by a patriot rebel who was able and willing to bear arms for the British Crown. The response was immediate and profound. Historians estimate that roughly 20,000 enslaved men and women fled to British lines during the course of the war, seeking the liberty that the Revolution's own language promised, but its patriot leaders refused to grant. Those who reached British lines became known as Black Loyalists. Some served in support capacities, some bore arms. When the war ended and the peace treaty was signed in 1783, roughly 3,000 were evacuated to Nova Scotia, where they settled in communities such as Birchtown. They received modest rations and promises of land that were frequently withheld. The winters were harsh, employment was scarce, discrimination was constant. Many eventually relocated again, some to London, where they joined the already impoverished Black Poor, and from there nearly 2,000 sailed to the newly founded colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone, carrying their long journey toward freedom across an ocean for the second or third time. Others chose a different path. Some African Americans fought in the Continental Army itself, integrated into most units, serving as infantrymen, drummers, and fifers. One regiment stands as a particular emblem of this service: the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, sometimes called the Black Regiment, which after February of 1778 was refilled largely with African American and Native American soldiers. They fought at Monmouth and Yorktown and other engagements, drawing pay and provisions equal to white soldiers, though barred from officer commissions. For many, service carried the promise of freedom at war's end. For others, that promise went unfulfilled. The Revolution's language of liberty, the soaring declaration that all men are created equal, stood in stark and uncomfortable contradiction to the institution of slavery that many of its loudest voices continued to sustain. Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration had condemned the slave trade, but the passage was removed to preserve the unity of the colonial coalition. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 would later produce the 3/5 Clause, a fugitive slave provision, and a moratorium on federal abolition of the slave trade until 1808. Compromises that reflected both the growing anti-slavery sentiment of the North and the fierce determination of the South to protect its plantation economy. The contradiction was named and acknowledged, even by some slaveholders themselves. It was not resolved. The Revolution was also a war that fractured native nations in ways whose consequences would stretch across generations. Most of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, allied with the British, believing that a British victory offered the best protection for their homelands against the tide of colonial settlement pressing westward. The Oneida and Tuscarora chose the American side. This division split the Confederacy along lines that had stood for centuries, setting brother against brother in a manner that mirrored the broader Civil War playing out across the colonies. In the summer of 1779, George Washington ordered an expedition to punish the Iroquois nations that had supported British raids on frontier settlements. Under Major General John Sullivan and Brigadier General James Clinton, Continental forces marched into the Finger Lakes region of present-day New York and systematically destroyed roughly 40 Iroquois towns. Longhouses were burned. Fields of corn, beans, and squash were torched or seized. More than 5,000 Iroquois refugees fled to British forts near Niagara, where severe winter starvation awaited many of them. The campaign achieved its military objective. The human cost was immense. For the native nations, the 1783 Treaty of Paris would deliver a final devastating blow. Vast western territories were transferred to the United States without a single native voice present at the negotiation. The British promises that had drawn many tribes into the war evaporated. The 1763 proclamation that had nominally limited colonial expansion into native lands was rendered meaningless. What followed, the Northwest Indian War, forced land cessions, and a long pattern of ignored treaties, set in motion a dispossession that would define the lives of native peoples for generations, and woven through all of it, through the partisan raids and the pitched battles, through the flight of the enslaved and the burning of the Iroquois towns, was the endurance of women. Women on both sides of the conflict ran farms and businesses, raised children and kept communities from dissolving entirely, while the men who might otherwise have managed those things were gone, wounded or dead. They organised boycotts of British goods. They spun homespun cloth to replace what could no longer be imported. They raised funds for Continental uniforms. As camp followers, they cooked and washed and nursed the sick and wounded, their labour essential to the army's survival, even when it went unacknowledged. Some went further. Margaret Corbin took over her husband's cannon after he was killed in battle and continued to fire it until she herself was wounded. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man, enlisted in the Continental Army in 1782, fought in several engagements, and was later wounded, her identity concealed until circumstance revealed it. Lydia Darrah overheard British plans in her own home and relayed them to Washington's forces. Emily Geiger, carrying a message through enemy territory, swallowed the letter rather than allow it to be captured. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John, urging the Continental Congress to remember the ladies in whatever new order of law they constructed. Mercy Otis Warren wrote plays and essays and eventually a pioneering history of the Revolution itself. Phyllis Wheatley, a woman who had been enslaved, wrote poetry celebrating liberty and was praised by George Washington, a poet who lived within the very contradiction the Revolution could not bring itself to fully confront. The toll on southern civilian communities was severe and lasting. Farms were stripped bare by troops on both sides. Homes were quartered, then burned. Disease spread through overcrowded camps and along the roads that armies travelled. Families were displaced. The enslaved were pressed into labour or fled into uncertainty. The cycle of raid and retaliation between Patriot and Loyalist neighbours left wounds that did not close quickly, wounds that were personal, rooted in memory, in the knowledge of who had done what to whom and why. The revolution in the South was not a clean story. It was a civil war within a revolution, a conflict that exposed every fault line running through colonial society, between those who owned the land and those who worked it, between those for whom liberty was a birthright and those for whom it remained a distant and elusive promise. By the time Greene's forces had worn Cornwallis thin across the Carolinas, the British general made a fateful decision, marching his army northward into Virginia toward a small coastal town called Yorktown, where the Revolution would reach its final decisive chapter. Chapter 6. Yorktown Victory in the World the Revolution Made. By the summer of 1781, the Long War had entered its final quiet turning. The campaigns had shifted southward, where the British General Lord Cornwallis had been pressing deep into the Carolinas and Virginia, testing the limits of a southern strategy that was beginning slowly and irrevocably to unravel. And so, following orders from his Commander-General Sir Henry Clinton, Cornwallis moved his army toward a small tobacco port on the Virginia coast, a place called Yorktown, seeking a deep-water harbour where the British fleet might anchor, resupply, and hold firm against the gathering storm. Yorktown sat along the York River, its position seemingly practical, even advantageous. Cornwallis fortified the town, dug his earthworks, and settled in to wait. What he could not have known was that the world was quietly repositioning itself all around him. To the north, General George Washington had spent much of 1781 with his eyes fixed on New York, the great British stronghold he had long wished to reclaim. His correspondence from those months speaks of a weakened British garrison, of a decisive opportunity waiting to be seized. But then, in the middle of August, a letter arrived that changed everything. Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, commanding a French fleet in the West Indies, had sent word that he was sailing for the Chesapeake Bay with 28 ships of the line and more than 3,000 troops. He could remain only until mid-October. The window was narrow, but it was open. Washington recognized the moment at once, together with the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, a quiet and dignified soldier who had arrived in Newport, Rhode Island the year before with the French Expeditionary Force. Washington abandoned the long-held dream of New York and turned his army south. False dispatches were sent, movements were concealed, and on the 19th of August the Great March began. Thousands of soldiers moved through the summer heat, down through New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Maryland, carrying with them the hope of a war's end. Rochambeau's army was a formidable force. Some 5,500 men organised into infantry regiments, artillery, engineers, and the cavalry unit known as Lauzun's Legion. Together with Washington's roughly 8,000 to 9,000 American troops, the combined Allied army numbered close to 20,000. They were marching toward a convergence that history would long remember. But the decisive blow would not come from the land. It would come from the sea. On the 5th of September 1781, in the open waters near the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, two fleets met. The French Admiral de Grasse, commanding 24 ships of the line, engaged the British fleet under Rear Admiral Sir Thomas Graves, who had brought 19 ships northward from New York in hopes of resupplying Cornwallis and relieving the growing pressure around Yorktown. What followed was a naval engagement that would quietly determine the fate of empires. The battle was not a dramatic destruction of one fleet by another. It was something more deliberate, a grinding, hours-long contest in the autumn Atlantic light, after which the British ships withdrew, too badly damaged to continue. Admiral Graves turned his fleet back toward New York. He would not return in time. The waters of the Chesapeake now belonged to France. With French ships sealing the bay, there would be no reinforcements for Cornwallis, no fresh supplies, no evacuation. The trap, though it did not yet feel like one, had closed around Yorktown with all the patience and inevitability of the turning tide. The Allied army arrived outside the town on the 28th of September. Siege lines were drawn with geometric precision. Earthworks rose from the Virginia clay. By early October, artillery batteries had been positioned and the bombardment began, French guns opening first, then American cannon joining in, the combined roar rolling across the low autumn landscape day after day. Then came the night of the 14th of October. Two small earthwork forts, redoubts 9 and 10, stood at the outer edges of the British defensive line, armed and garrisoned, protecting the flanks of the position. If they fell, the Allies could press a second line of siege work so close that no defence could long withstand it. Around 400 French troops stormed Redoubt 9 in the darkness. Around 400 American soldiers moved against Redoubt 10. Their orders were to advance with bayonets without firing to preserve the silence of surprise. Leading the American assault on a Redoubt 10 was a young lieutenant colonel who had been pressing for the assignment, Alexander Hamilton, commanding a light infantry battalion, moving forward in the autumn dark with a kind of fierce, purposeful energy that his contemporaries described with something close to awe. Both redoubts fell in under 30 minutes. The fighting was close and brutal, the casualties real and mourned. But the works were taken, and with them, the last hope of holding the siege at arm's length. Cornwallis attempted one final escape. On the night of the 16th of October, he began moving men across the York River in boats, hoping to break through the thinning lines opposite and march his army north toward freedom. 16 boats pushed out into the current. and then the sky broke open. A sudden and violent storm scattered the boats, drove them off course, and made any further crossing impossible. The weather itself, it seemed, had made its decision. Cornwallis's men were brought back to Yorktown. On the 17th of October, a drummer boy appeared on the British parapet, and behind him an officer bearing a white flag. 2 days later, on the 19th of October 1781, the formal surrender took place. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the British and Hessian troops marched out of Yorktown's fortifications. The ceremony was attended by Washington and Rochambeau and their officers, arranged in long, quiet lines. Lord Cornwallis did not appear. He cited illness, and his deputy, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, carried out the surrender in his place. O'Hara first moved toward the French commander Rochambeau, then toward Washington. Washington, unwilling to accept the sword from a deputy rather than the general himself, directed his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, to receive it. The British troops marched between the Allied lines, their colours cased, their drums beating. Popular legend would later say the band played a tune called The World Turned Upside Down, a fitting and evocative image. But no eyewitness at the time recorded it. The story appeared first in a memoir, written in 1828, long after the event had passed into memory and myth. What is certain is that more than 7,000 British soldiers laid down their arms that October afternoon, and with them the last meaningful hope of British victory in America. When news of the surrender reached London on the 25th of November, Prime Minister Lord North received it with a despair he could not conceal. "Oh God," he reportedly said, "it is all over, it is all over." His government did not survive the winter. By March of 1782, Parliament had passed measures effectively ending British commitment to the war. North's ministry fell, and with it, the long campaign to hold the American colonies. Negotiations for peace moved slowly through 1782 and into 1783. The American representatives, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, worked in Paris, navigating the complex currents of European diplomacy. The treaty they signed on the 3rd of September 1783 was generous beyond what many had expected. Britain formally recognised the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. The new nation's boundaries were drawn from the Atlantic coast westward to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes in the north to the northern border of Spanish Florida in the south, a vast territory that had been held in British hands and was now relinquished entirely. Fishing rights were granted, prisoners were to be returned, British troops were to withdraw. Britain made these concessions not from charity but from exhaustion and calculation. The war had grown financially ruinous. France, Spain, and the Netherlands had turned the conflict into a global struggle that threatened British interests far beyond North America. By releasing the American states and negotiating peace, Britain sought to end the bleeding and preserve what remained of its empire elsewhere. For the Loyalists, those Americans who had remained faithful to the crown, the treaty offered little protection. Roughly 70,000 of them departed the new United States in the years following the war. Many went north to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and what would become Ontario, arriving with British land grants and little else. Tens of thousands more crossed to Britain, where many fell into poverty. Black Loyalists promised freedom in exchange for service often found only new forms of hardship, many eventually resettling in Sierra Leone. Those who remained in America faced social pressure, economic loss, and the quiet hostility of neighbours who had chosen the other side. The new nation that emerged from the Revolution was far from settled. The Articles of Confederation, drafted during the war and ratified in 1781, had created a federal government so weak it could barely function. It could declare war but not raise troops. It could spend money but not collect taxes. It could negotiate treaties but not enforce them. When indebted farmers in western Massachusetts, many of them veterans of the very war that had promised them liberty, rose in what became known as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, the national government was powerless to respond. The state had to fund its own militia to suppress the uprising. The fragility of the arrangement was impossible to ignore. The Constitutional Convention that gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was the answer. 55 delegates, presided over by George Washington himself, meeting in the same hall where the Declaration had been signed a decade before. Over 4 months they argued and compromised and rebuilt the framework of government from the ground up. They debated representation, settling on a Congress with a population-based House and an equal vote Senate, a resolution that became known as the Great Compromise. They debated the nature of executive power, the structure of the courts, the balance between federal authority and the sovereignty of the states. And they debated slavery, not openly, not with the full weight the subject demanded, but in the careful, uncomfortable language of compromise. The 3/5 clause counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, giving slaveholding states greater political power while never acknowledging the full humanity of those being counted. The international slave trade was protected from federal interference for 20 years. Escaped enslaved persons were required to be returned to their owners. The word slavery never appeared in the document, but its presence ran through every line of the Southern Compromises. The Constitution that emerged was not a perfect instrument. Federalists and anti-federalists argued bitterly over its ratification. One side warning of tyranny and a powerful central government, the other warning of chaos without one. The debate was real, and it touched on questions that would continue to surface in American political life for generations. For women, the revolution had opened small doors without unlocking the larger ones. Some states briefly extended property-owning women the right to vote, New Jersey among them, until 1807. Courts began to recognize limited rights for unmarried women, and some inheritance customs were reformed. But the legal doctrine of coverture remained intact, rendering married women essentially invisible in the eyes of the law. The revolutionary language of liberty and equality planted seeds that would take another century and more to fully flower. For enslaved people, the legacy was a study in painful contradiction. Some northern states moved toward abolition. Some enslaved individuals had won their freedom through military service. The revolutionary principles of natural rights had given new urgency and moral vocabulary to the anti-slavery cause. But the Constitution entrenched slavery in the nation's founding document. And in the South, the institution would not merely survive, it would expand, fed by the growing cotton economy, until the contradictions became too great to contain by any means short of war. For Native American nations, the Treaty of Paris had been signed without any consultation or protection for the indigenous peoples who had lived on the lands now so easily ceded to the new republic. Alliances with the British or with the Patriots had offered no lasting security. The borders drawn in Paris ignored the nations that had called those lands home for generations. What followed was a long, painful story of encroachment, broken agreements, and dispossession that would unfold across the following century. And yet, for all its contradictions and incomplete promises, the American Revolution sent something out into the world that could not easily be recalled. The Declaration of Independence, with its insistence on self-evident truths and unalienable rights, travelled across oceans and took root in unfamiliar soil. French reformers drew directly from American ideals when they wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789. The bankruptcy brought on by France's support of the American War helped ignite the revolution that followed. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had fought at Yorktown, would stand at the center of the French Revolution's early days. Latin American leaders in the following decades, Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and others, looked to the American example when they imagined what independence might mean for their own peoples. George Washington, stepping back from power voluntarily in 1796, offered the nation a farewell address that had the quality of a quiet benediction. He warned against the dangers of faction and partisan division. He urged neutrality in foreign affairs, a policy of commerce without permanent political entanglement. He spoke of the need for religion, morality, and education to sustain a republic, and of fiscal prudence to preserve what had been so dearly won. It was the counsel of a man who had seen what it cost to build something fragile and lasting in the world. Historians have long debated what precisely the American Revolution was. Some have argued it was a conservative event, a defense of existing privileges by a colonial elite who simply wished to govern themselves without interference. Others have pointed to the genuinely radical shifts it produced, in the language of equality, in the erosion of aristocratic titles and customs, in the reshaping of relationships between the powerful and the ordinary. The truth, as it so often does, seems to rest somewhere in the long and complicated space between these views. What is certain is that something had changed, not completely, not for everyone, not at once, but changed in ways that could not be reversed. A new kind of government had been placed in the world, built on the idea that authority flows upward from the people rather than downward from crowns and bloodlines. Whether it would live up to that idea, for all of its people, in all of its generations, remained the unfinished work it still, in many ways, remains today. And so the story of the American Revolution does not end with a victory parade or a simple resolution. It ends, as all great historical transformations do, with a new set of questions, a new set of struggles, and a world forever changed by the courage and contradictions of those who dared to imagine something that had never existed before.